Jack, a battle-worn veteran hiding from the world, thought the silence of the Colorado mountains would be his only companion, until his German shepherd, Buddy, began to bark furiously in the storm. Following the dog through the snow, Jack stumbled upon a woman collapsed in the drifts, her lips trembling with a desperate whisper, "He has my sister, locked away." In that moment, Jack realized this was no lost wanderer. This was a plea, a mission. With Buddy at his side, he was about to face a secret buried deep in the woods. The Colorado mountains lay buried under a vast quilt of snow, their peaks shrouded in clouds that moved like gray ships across the sky. Jack Miller trudged along the narrow path leading up to his cabin, the sound of his boots crunching in the frozen silence. At 37 years old, Jack carried himself with the heavy posture of a man who had survived more winters than he had ever expected, both on the battlefield and in the solitude of his own life. His tall frame was hardened by years of service in the Army, the kind of wiry muscle that remained even when food was scarce and days were long. His hair, once dark, now held the first threads of silver that ran above his ears, and his beard, trimmed close against the cold, carried flecks of gray that made him look older than his years. His eyes, a muted steel blue, seemed always narrowed against invisible winds, as though scanning for dangers that no longer existed. The war had ended for him years ago, but the memories had not. They lingered in his expression, in the way he seldom smiled, in the quiet suspicion with which he regarded the world. He lived apart not because he hated people, but because the presence of others reminded him too much of the comrades he had lost. The cabin itself was a structure of weathered pine logs, built decades ago by hands that knew the violence of Colorado winters. It had a pitched roof laden with snow, a chimney that puffed smoke like a tired old engine, and windows that looked out over a valley where elk sometimes wandered. Inside, it was warm, not luxurious, with an iron stove, a rough-hewn table, and a bed he had built himself out of oak. The walls bore no photographs, no trinkets, nothing of his past. Jack had stripped his surroundings down to their essence, believing that if he removed reminders, he could remove the pain. It did not always work. At his side trotted Buddy, a 6-year-old German shepherd, with sable and black fur and a noble posture that betrayed both strength and intelligence. Buddy's coat was thick and well-groomed, his ears constantly alert to the smallest rustle, his amber eyes sharp and unyielding, but softened whenever they met Jack's gaze. He was not simply a dog rescued from a shelter, nor merely a pet. Buddy had been with Jack since his discharge, a companion through nights of trembling nightmares and mornings when Jack wondered if life was worth enduring. Unlike the men Jack had once led in combat, Buddy asked for no speeches, no orders, no promises. He asked only for food, for companionship, and for the simple reassurance of Jack's presence. In return, he gave loyalty beyond measure, a steadfastness that grounded Jack when his mind threatened to spiral back into war's chaos. Buddy had a faint scar across his flank, the remnant of a wild encounter with a mountain lion 2 years ago when he had defended Jack without hesitation. Since then, Jack thought of him less as a dog and more as a fellow soldier. On this particular evening, as the light dwindled into indigo shadows and the air sharpened with the scent of pine and frost, Jack allowed himself the small pleasure of silence. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder, more for caution than for necessity, and in his gloved hands he held a small bundle of kindling. Buddy moved ahead, nose down, tail wagging slightly, his paws making clean impressions in the snow. Jack felt a twinge of something like peace, though he hardly recognized it. After years of firefights and fractured orders, of deserts that smelled of dust and blood, the quiet was both a balm and a curse. It soothed him, yes, but it also forced him to hear the voices he could never silence. The young men who had fallen beside him, the friends whose names were etched in his memory. He often thought that solitude was not truly freedom, but a different kind of prison, where the guards were invisible and the walls were his own regrets. He set the kindling by the stove inside the cabin, removing his gloves and rubbing warmth back into his fingers. Buddy patted across the floorboards, nails clicking softly, before settling on the bearskin rug near the fire. Jack crouched beside him, running his hand through the thick fur, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. For a moment he wondered how strange it was that his closest confidant was an animal. Yet he knew there was no judgment in Buddy's gaze, only the unspoken understanding of one survivor to another. "You and me, pal," Jack murmured, his voice roughened by disuse. "Just you and me." Buddy's tail thumped softly against the floor, and his eyes half closed in contentment. As the night deepened, the wind rose outside, rattling the shutters like restless fingers. Jack sat in his armchair by the fire, a battered journal resting on his knee. He had tried many times to put words on the page, to describe what had been lost, but the ink always dried into silence. Tonight, as he stared at the empty lines, he thought instead of what had brought him here, the need to vanish, the hope that distance from the world would mean distance from his memories. Yet he also thought of Buddy, how the dog had never questioned his silences, how his simple presence had dragged Jack back from the brink more than once. Perhaps, he wondered, solitude was not about absence at all, but about choosing who remained. In that sense, Buddy was not a reminder of the past, but a reason to endure the present. The fire crackled low, shadows flickering across Jack's weathered face, carving deep lines that spoke of fatigue and resilience. In equal measure. He leaned back, listening to the storm pressing against the cabin walls, and felt the oddest thing, not despair, not dread, but a fragile thread of gratitude, for the cabin that kept him safe, for the silence that sometimes healed, for the dog at his feet who had become his anchor. The world outside was vast and merciless, but within these walls, Jack Miller and Buddy had carved out a fragile, stubborn sanctuary. In that quiet, Jack closed his eyes, and for the first time in many days, he let sleep come without resistance. The storm had not yet loosened its grip on the mountains, and by late afternoon the snow fell in thick veils, obscuring the trees until they seemed like phantoms pressed close against the world. Jack Miller had been chopping firewood beside his cabin when Buddy suddenly froze, ears pricked, his body taut with alertness. A low growl rose from the dog's chest, not of threat, but of urgency. And in the next moment, he erupted into frantic barking, sprinting toward the tree line. Jack dropped the axe, his instincts firing in the way they always did when Buddy reacted. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and plunged after the dog, boots crunching through snow that reached nearly to his knees. Buddy's paw prints darted ahead, straight and purposeful, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Jack's heart hammered with the strange tension of not knowing what awaited them, the same taut coil of anticipation he had felt before patrols in far-off deserts. It was Buddy's sense of something unseen that pulled him forward, and Jack trusted that instinct as he once trusted a seasoned sergeant's word. They pressed deeper into the trees until Jack spotted a dark shape crumpled near the base of a pine, half buried by the swirling snow. His first thought was that it might be an animal, but then the shape shifted, a weak hand clawing against the drift. It was a woman. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, brushing snow from her face. She appeared to be in her early 40s, though hardship had carved lines into her skin that made her look older. Her hair, once chestnut brown, hung in damp, tangled strands across her face, streaked with ice. She was of average height, but now seemed small and fragile, her shoulders hunched, her body trembling violently beneath a torn wool coat, far too thin for the weather. Her skin was pale, almost bluish from the cold, and her lips were cracked, blood mingling with frost. Jack could see exhaustion etched deep in her features, eyes red-rimmed, cheekbones sharp from hunger, the kind of fatigue that came not from a single night, but from days of struggle. Yet beneath the fear and weakness, her hazel eyes burned with an urgency that refused to die. "Easy," Jack muttered, his voice steady despite the storm whipping around them. He wrapped an arm beneath her shoulders, feeling how light she was, as though the snow itself weighed more than she did. Buddy pressed close, whining softly, his muzzle nudging the woman's arm as though urging her to hold on. She tried to speak, but the words collapsed into ragged coughs. Jack adjusted his grip and began the slow trek back to the cabin, the weight of her frail body heavy in his arms, but not unfamiliar. He had carried wounded men before, and though the circumstances were different, the sensation clawed at his chest, bringing back memories of battlefields where lives slipped away in the dark. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the present. By the time they reached the cabin, Jack's breath was a ragged fog in the air. He kicked the door open with his boot, carried the woman inside, and laid her carefully onto the bearskin rug near the fire. Buddy circled anxiously, his tail stiff, his gaze fixed on her face. Jack stripped off her soaked coat, wrapped her in blankets, and moved quickly to stoke the fire until the flames roared back to life. He filled a tin cup with heated water, cooled it just enough, and coaxed a few sips past her cracked lips. At first she resisted, her body too weak, but then she drank greedily, her throat working with desperate swallows. Slowly, a flush of life returned to her face. After an hour, she stirred more fully, opening her eyes to the warm glow of firelight. Her voice, when it came, was raspy but clear enough. Where am I?" she whispered. "My cabin," Jack replied, crouching nearby. His voice was calm, but his steel-blue eyes studied her with measured caution. "You were out there in the snow. Wouldn't have made it much longer. Name?" "Emily," she breathed, her lips trembling. "Emily Carter." Jack nodded once. He always believed names mattered. They gave weight to survival, turned strangers into people. He had learned too often how quickly names could vanish when death came too soon. He glanced toward Buddy, who had settled close to Emily, resting his head on his paws, but keeping his amber eyes trained on her every movement. Emily attempted to sit up, clutching the blanket tighter around herself. She was still trembling, though less violently, and her breath came in shallow pulls. In the firelight, her features seemed sharper, high cheekbones, a narrow chin, and eyes that seemed constantly on the verge of tears. She had the look of someone who had not only faced the cold, but carried the burden of something heavier, something festering inside. Jack brought her a piece of bread and a bowl of thin stew. She ate slowly, her hands shaking, but with each bite color returned faintly to her cheeks. He could see she was not accustomed to receiving care. There was a hesitance in her movements, like a woman who had learned to endure alone. When she finally set the bowl aside, her gaze met Jack's and held there, unblinking, as though wrestling with whether to speak. Jack leaned back, his voice quiet but firm. "You want to tell me why you were out there? People don't just wander these woods in a storm, especially not alone." Emily's fingers twisted the edge of the blanket. Her lips parted, and for a moment no sound came, only the flicker of fear across her face. Then her voice cracked, low and trembling. "I had to run. My sister, she's still trapped." Jack's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had expected perhaps a story of being lost, of an accident. This was different. Buddy's ears perked, his body shifting closer as though he understood the weight in Emily's words. "Trapped?" Jack repeated, his tone sharper. Emily nodded frantically, tears brimming in her eyes. "A man, Dylan. He has her locked away. He wants the land. He said he'd kill her if I didn't give him what he wanted. I managed to escape, but—" Her voice broke into sobs, muffled by her hands. Jack remained silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Inside, something old and unwilling stirred within him. That instinct to act, to protect, the part of himself he thought he had buried beneath snow and solitude. He could feel Buddy's gaze on him, steady and knowing, as though the dog sensed what decision loomed. Emily's plea was not just desperation. It was a call for help he could not ignore. For now, though, Jack said nothing more. He stood, adjusted the blanket around Emily, and muttered, "Rest. You're safe here tonight." He turned toward the window, the storm still raging outside, but in his mind the silence of solitude was already broken. The storm outside raged into the night, snow hammering against the cabin walls like the fists of 1,000 restless spirits. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, casting shifting shadows across the rough pine logs. Jack Miller sat at the table with his arms folded, his eyes narrowed, his mind caught between disbelief and reluctant curiosity. Emily Carter, wrapped in blankets, sat hunched near the fire, her shoulders trembling, though the warmth had begun to seep back into her body. Her hazel eyes, wide and unblinking, clung to him with the intensity of someone who had been silenced too long and now had only this moment to speak. Her voice, raspy at first, grew stronger as desperation carried it. She spoke of her sister, Sarah. Sarah was younger than Emily by nearly a decade, slender and willowy, with a frame that once carried the easy grace of youth. She had hair the color of golden wheat, long and usually braided, though Emily's voice faltered when she described how Dylan had cut it short with a hunting knife in a fit of cruelty. Her skin, naturally fair, had been left pale and hollow by weeks of confinement, and her bright green eyes that once carried a sparkle of mischief were now dimmed by fear. Sarah was a gentle soul, one who loved wildflowers and sketching in the margins of old books, someone whose laughter had once filled the family farm with light. She had never been strong in body, often plagued by fainting spells as a child, but her spirit had always been unyielding. Now, Emily said, that spirit was flickering, imprisoned in a dark shack under the weight of another man's greed. Dylan's name left her lips like a curse. Jack leaned forward, listening, his jaw tightening as the picture of the man emerged from Emily's trembling words. Dylan was tall and broad-shouldered, with the heavy-set build of someone accustomed to manual labor, but twisted by years of resentment and envy. He was in his late 40s, his once handsome face marred by a jagged scar across his jaw, a memento from a drunken fight in his youth. His beard was coarse, shot with gray, and his dark hair unkempt, falling over a brow that seemed permanently furrowed. Emily described his eyes as black and unfeeling, the kind of eyes that stared without warmth, as though calculating the value of everything in sight. He had grown up near the Carter family farm, always simmering with bitterness, believing life had cheated him out of what he deserved. When the county records office burned down in 1998, destroying property deeds and titles, Dylan saw his opportunity. He claimed that the Carters' land, rich with the promise of mineral deposits discovered in recent surveys, was rightfully his, citing false stories and twisted half-truths. To enforce his claim, he had turned to violence, first through threats, then through captivity. Sarah had been the easiest target, vulnerable, kind-hearted, and least likely to resist. Dylan locked her in a remote cabin, chaining her to fear while demanding Emily hand over any remaining proof of ownership. Emily's voice cracked as she described the night she escaped. Dylan had left her unguarded briefly, confident in the snowstorm's cruelty to finish what he started. She slipped through a broken panel near the rear of the shack, barefoot in the snow, clutching nothing but the hope of finding help. She had wandered for hours, the wind tearing at her until her legs gave way. Buddy had found her then, the amber-eyed shepherd pushing his muzzle against her cheek, his bark cutting through her fading consciousness. She sobbed when she spoke of that moment, because she knew if not for the dog, she would have become another frozen body hidden under the drifts by morning. Jack listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on the flames. Inside, he wrestled with the familiar pull of duty. He had buried that part of himself in the quiet of these mountains, but Emily's words dragged it to the surface. He imagined Sarah, pale and trembling, locked in a cabin, while snow pressed heavy against the roof, while Dylan's footsteps echoed outside her prison. He imagined Emily's desperation, forcing herself through the storm with nothing but sheer will. He imagined, too, the countless times he had sworn to protect those weaker than himself, the promises etched into his soul on battlefields where mercy was scarce. His chest tightened and his jaw clenched until he could feel the ache in his teeth. Emily's hands gripped the blanket so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw, "you're the only one who can help her. No one else will come. The sheriff thinks Dylan is just another angry farmer. They don't know what he's capable of. He'll kill her. I know he will." Her tears spilled freely now, her face contorted in a mixture of fear and fury. "I can't lose her, not like this." Not to him, Buddy shifted from his spot near the fire, rising to his paws and padding closer. He placed his head on Emily's knee, his amber eyes lifting to hers. It was as though the dog understood her pain, offering silent comfort. Emily reached down with trembling fingers, stroking the thick fur, her sobs quieting into hiccups. The simple gesture broke Jack's silence. He rose slowly from his chair, his tall frame looming in the firelight, his expression carved from stone. "You think I'm a savior," he said, his voice low, almost gravelly. "I'm not. I left that part of my life behind for a reason." His eyes flicked toward the window where the snow pressed against the glass. "But I won't ignore what you've told me. If what you're saying is true, then Dylan's not just a thief. He's a coward who preys on the helpless. And I can't abide cowards." Emily lifted her gaze, hope flickering there, though fear still clouded it. "Then you'll help?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. Jack looked down at Buddy, who stood tall now, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on him as if awaiting orders. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "We'll see about your sister," he muttered. "But understand this, once we go looking for trouble, it won't stop until it's finished." Emily nodded, her tears still shining but tempered now by the spark of hope. For the first time in weeks, she felt less alone, though she knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm yet to come. The storm eased by dawn, leaving the Colorado forest blanketed in pristine white, its silence broken only by the groan of trees bowing under the weight of ice. Jack Miller stood at the cabin's single window, his tall frame rigid, shoulders squared, as if he were once again on the edge of a battlefield. His steel blue eyes scanned the endless trees, but his mind was far from the quiet landscape. For years he had told himself that solitude was his salvation, a retreat from promises that had bled men dry. Yet behind him, on the worn armchair, Emily Carter sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her hazel eyes fixed on him with a plea that felt heavier than the storm itself. Buddy sat at her feet, his male and black fur bristling slightly, ears flicking each time the woman shifted. The German shepherd, nearly 6 years old now, seemed to sense the storm inside Jack better than the one outside. Jack's hands tightened on the wooden window frame. He had spent too long burying the soldier in him beneath snow and silence. But Emily's words had torn that burial shroud open. He heard her voice even now. Sarah, locked away, Sarah's laughter cut short, Sarah's life in the hands of a man who thrived on cruelty. The name Dylan felt like a thorn lodged in his thoughts, sharp and festering. He had seen men like Dylan before, men who preyed on the weak because they lacked the courage to stand against equals. Cowards wrapped in brutality. Emily shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Though she had regained some color in her cheeks since the night before, she still looked fragile. Her face, framed by strands of chestnut hair now drying into unruly waves, was marked with exhaustion. Yet her eyes burned with determination, and that strength unsettled Jack more than her weakness had. She reminded him of widows he had seen in war zones, women who had lost everything but still found enough in themselves to fight for those they loved. "You don't understand," Emily said quietly, her voice raw but steady. "If we don't act soon, Sarah won't last." "He doesn't feed her properly. He wants to break her, make her desperate enough to sign anything. I can't go back there alone. He'll kill me before I even reach the door." Jack turned from the window, his face carved in lines of reluctance and resolve. He had sworn never to lead another mission, never again to be responsible for a life. And yet here he stood, facing the undeniable weight of another choice. Buddy padded across the cabin floor and stopped before him, amber eyes fixed, ears perked. It was not the frantic energy of a dog seeking play, but the calm alertness of a soldier awaiting command. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. "You don't give me much peace, do you, old boy?" he muttered, his voice laced with weary affection. Buddy's tail gave a single thump, as though in answer. Jack reached for the iron stove, stirred the fire into a steady blaze, then moved to the corner where his pack lay. The canvas bag was scarred, edges frayed but still sturdy. He set it on the table and began to fill it with care: a coil of rope, a hunting knife, spare cartridges for the rifle, a compass worn from desert sands, and a canteen. Each object was placed deliberately, his movements silent but heavy with memory. Emily watched, her lips parting slightly as realization dawned. "You're going," she whispered, a note of disbelief mingling with hope. Jack paused, glancing up at her. "We're going," he corrected, his voice low but certain. "You know the land better than I do. You'll guide me to Dylan's cabin. I'll take care of the rest." Emily's throat tightened and tears welled in her eyes, though she fought them back. She nodded quickly, clutching the blanket tighter. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Jack studied her for a long moment, noting the faint lines at the corners of her mouth, the hands that trembled not from cold, but from fear she could not disguise. She was no soldier, no fighter, but courage was not always measured in battles won. Sometimes it was measured in the refusal to surrender hope. He saw that now, and it stirred something in him he had thought long gone. The preparations continued. Jack checked the rifle, an old Winchester with scratches across its stock, but still dependable. He cleaned the barrel, oiled the moving parts, and laid it across the table. Buddy followed every motion, ears twitching at the familiar rhythm of readiness. Jack strapped a sheath to his belt, the knife's hilt worn smooth by years of use. He pulled on his heavy winter coat, the fabric patched in places but warm, and laced his boots tight. The routine steadied him, reminded him of order, of discipline. Emily rose unsteadily from the chair, adjusting the scarf Jack had given her. She was of average height, her posture slightly hunched from fatigue, but she carried herself with an effort that made her seem taller. "What if he has others with him?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharp with fear. Jack shook his head. "Dylan's the type who trusts his own fists more than allies. Men like him don't share power. They hoard it. But if there's someone else, we'll handle it." He spoke with the calm certainty of a soldier who had faced worse odds, though inside he knew the risk was real. The hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the hiss of wind against the walls. Jack's mind replayed images he had long tried to bury. Patrols in desert heat, the smell of cordite after firefights, the weight of promises broken by death. He thought of the soldiers who had looked to him for guidance, men who never made it home. And now Emily's hazel eyes joined that gallery of faces, reminding him that walking away was no longer an option. As evening fell, he finally broke the silence. "We leave at first." "Light," he said, his voice carrying no room for debate. Emily let out a breath she had been holding and gave a small nod. Buddy, as if understanding, rose and settled by the door, his body stretched in silent vigilance. Jack moved to the hearth, stirring the coals. His reflection flickered in the firelight. Broad shoulders, scarred hands, eyes that had seen too much. He wondered if this decision would lead him back into darkness, or if perhaps, for once, it might lead him toward redemption. He knew only one truth. He could not stand by while a woman remained captive to a coward's greed. He turned, his gaze sweeping from Emily to Buddy, and allowed the smallest trace of resolve to enter his voice. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll bring her back." The first light of dawn barely touched the Colorado peaks, the horizon painted in muted grays and faint streaks of orange. The storm had passed, leaving the forest weighed down by heavy snow that glistened under the pale sky. Jack Miller adjusted the straps of his canvas pack, the familiar weight pressing against his broad shoulders. The rifle was slung securely across his back, his knife at his belt, and coils of rope tucked into the side. His steel blue eyes scanned the silent world ahead, wary of what it concealed. At his side, Buddy padded forward, his thick coat dusted with frost, breath steaming in the cold. The German shepherd moved with confidence, ears swiveling, nose low to the ground. His gait was purposeful, less like a pet's eager stride, and more like a seasoned scout patrolling hostile terrain. Behind them walked Emily Carter, her chestnut hair tucked under a woolen cap Jack had given her, her frame still fragile but steadier than the night before. Wrapped tightly in Jack's spare coat, she clutched her arms against her chest, hazel eyes fixed on the path Buddy carved through the snow. Determination hardened her face, though each step was a struggle, her boots sinking into drifts nearly to her knees. The silence of the forest pressed around them, broken only by the creak of ice-laden branches and the crunch of their footsteps. Jack's senses sharpened in the stillness, the rhythm of survival returning to him like muscle memory. He measured distance in strides, calculated direction by the sun's pale arc, and listened to the subtle cues in Buddy's behavior. When the dog paused, body rigid, ears forward, Jack stopped immediately, hand hovering near his rifle. When Buddy moved again, Jack exhaled slowly, his tension easing fractionally. Emily watched this exchange with silent awe, realizing how much passed between man and animal without a single word. Hours into the march, they reached the first of many obstacles, a frozen creek wide enough to demand caution. The surface gleamed like glass, the current audible in faint gurgles beneath. Jack tested the ice with the butt of his rifle, his jaw tightening as a faint crack echoed. He looked back at Emily. "Step exactly where I do. No sudden movements. If the ice groans, stop." His voice was calm, measured, the tone of command honed by years of necessity. Emily nodded quickly, her breath fogging in short bursts. Buddy stepped forward first, surprisingly light-footed for his size, his paws pressing carefully. Jack followed, his boots landing where Buddy's prints marked the path, each step deliberate. Emily moved last, heart hammering, her eyes fixed on Jack's broad back. The ice creaked once beneath her, sharp as a gunshot in the silence, but Jack turned swiftly, steadying her with a hand to her arm. His grip was firm, reassuring. They crossed without further incident, and Emily exhaled a sob of relief once her boots sank into solid snow again. The forest thickened, towering, pines rising like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. Light barely filtered through, painting the path in shadows. Buddy's ears flicked often, his body tense, as if sensing movement beyond their sight. Jack kept his rifle ready, scanning the tree line. Memories intruded unbidden, ambushes in foreign deserts, the whistle of incoming rounds, the faces of men who never returned. He shook them off, focusing on the present. This was not war, yet his instincts told him danger could linger here all the same. They stopped briefly in a small clearing sheltered from the wind. Jack knelt, pulling bread and jerky from his pack, passing a portion to Emily. She ate quietly, hands trembling more from hunger than cold. Buddy sat close, tail brushing the snow, his amber eyes scanning the perimeter even as Jack fed him scraps. Emily's gaze lingered on the dog. "He's different," she said softly, almost to herself. Jack glanced at her. "He's a soldier, same as I was," he replied simply, his voice edged with something between pride and sadness. As they continued, Emily began to speak, perhaps to distract herself from the fatigue gnawing at her legs. She told Jack more about Sarah, how her younger sister had once dreamed of teaching art, how she filled sketchbooks with drawings of wildflowers and mountain ridges, how she had a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. Her voice cracked when she admitted she feared Dylan had crushed that laughter forever. Jack listened silently, his jaw set, but inside he felt the weight of those words. He could almost see Sarah's face, the gentle eyes, the softness in her smile, now imprisoned behind locked doors. The image pressed against his soldier's resolve, hardening it into something unbreakable. Midday brought another challenge, a steep incline where the snow had drifted deep, nearly waist-high. Jack cut steps with his boots, gripping branches for balance, hauling Emily upward when her strength faltered. She slipped once, falling to her knees, but Jack caught her under the arms and pulled her upright. His hands were strong, his grip unyielding, but his eyes softened briefly as he steadied her. "One step at a time," he murmured, his voice low enough only she could hear. Emily nodded, her teeth chattering, but she pressed forward. Buddy bounded ahead, leaping through the drifts with a soldier's resilience, pausing often to look back, urging them onward. By late afternoon, the wind sharpened again, cutting through their coats like knives. Snow whipped in flurries, obscuring the path. Jack raised a hand, signaling a stop. They huddled beneath the shelter of a massive pine, branches bending low to shield them. Jack struck a match, coaxing a small fire to life in a hollow scraped free of snow. Emily leaned close, her face pale, but her eyes alive with determination. "We're close," she said, her voice hoarse. Jack looked at her, one brow lifting. "You're certain?" Emily nodded. "I remember the ridgeline." Dylan's shack isn't far. Maybe a few hours, if the snow holds. Jack studied her expression, searching for doubt, but found none. He glanced at Buddy, whose gaze was fixed beyond the trees, ears twitching at some sound distant but real. The dog gave a low growl, not of fear, but of warning. Jack's hand went instinctively to his rifle. The forest was not as empty as it seemed. They pressed on as the light waned, the shadows stretching long and dark. Each step felt heavier, the silence more oppressive, as though the woods themselves knew what lay ahead. Emily stumbled once more, but caught herself, refusing Jack's outstretched hand. Her lips were set in a line of stubborn resolve. She would not be a burden, not when Sarah's life hung in the balance. Jack watched her quietly, a flicker of respect passing through his weary eyes. By the time the sky deepened into purple twilight, they reached another clearing, a place where the snow lay undisturbed, eerily perfect. Buddy stopped suddenly, body stiff, ears forward, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Jack lifted his rifle, scanning the tree line, every muscle tense. The air felt charged, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He glanced at Emily, who clutched her coat tighter, her eyes wide but steady. "Not much farther," Jack murmured, though whether to reassure her or himself, he could not say. He looked down at Buddy, who stood like a sentinel, his amber eyes gleaming in the fading light. The dog gave a single bark, sharp and decisive, before bounding forward. Jack followed, Emily close behind. The journey through snow was not yet over, but the path was set, and there would be no turning back. Twilight bled into night as the three figures pressed through the final stretch of forest, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The trees thinned into a clearing where a lone cabin stood, half surrendered to the wilderness. Its roof sagged under the weight of years and storms, but a faint light flickered inside, leaking through cracks in the shutters. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, proof of a fire burning within. Jack Miller stopped at the edge of the clearing, crouching low. His steel-blue eyes narrowed as he studied the shack, every instinct sharpened. Buddy crept beside him, ears flat, his sable and black fur bristling, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Emily Carter stood just behind, clutching her coat tight, her hazel eyes locked on the cabin. Fear quivered in her breath, but her stance remained rigid with determination. Jack's soldier's mind calculated every detail. The single-entry door, padlocked from the outside. The window to the left, its glass cracked. The faint outline of footprints pressed into snow, some fresh, leading away from the door toward the tree line. He knew Dylan was out there, not far. He leaned close to Emily, his voice low and deliberate. "Stay behind me. No matter what happens, you don't move unless I tell you." Emily nodded, her lips pressed tight. Jack moved forward, his rifle steady in his hands. Buddy advanced in unison, shoulders hunched, eyes gleaming in the dim light. At the cabin door, Jack raised the rifle high and brought the butt down hard against the padlock. The first blow echoed like a gunshot across the clearing. The lock held but groaned. Jack struck again, muscles coiling, his breath sharp in the freezing air. The third strike shattered the rusted metal, the padlock clattering to the snow. He shoved the door open. The cabin's interior smelled of smoke and damp rot. Shadows writhed on the walls, thrown by a sputtering lantern that sat precariously on a crooked table. Against the far wall, on a crude wooden bed, lay Sarah Carter. She was barely more than a shadow of the woman Emily had described. Thin, almost skeletal, her fair skin pale and mottled with bruises, her golden hair hacked unevenly, falling in ragged strands around her face. Her green eyes, once bright, were sunken, glazed with exhaustion, but they flickered alive as the door burst open. Chains bound her wrists to the headboard, her lips cracked from thirst. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped. Emily cried out, rushing forward, but Jack caught her arm, pulling her back. "Wait." He scanned the room quickly, rifle raised, his senses tuned to the slightest sound. Only when he was sure no one else lurked in the shadows did he move toward Sarah. He slung his rifle across his back, drew his knife, and cut through the bindings with quick, precise motions. Sarah collapsed into his arms, her body frighteningly light. Jack set her gently back on the bed, his rough hands adjusting the blanket to cover her trembling frame. "You're safe now," he muttered, his voice low, though he knew safety was far from certain. Emily knelt beside her sister, tears streaming, stroking her hair. "Sarah, it's me. You're going to be okay." Sarah's lips trembled, her voice a broken whisper. "He'll come back. He said he always comes back." Jack stiffened. The words had barely left her mouth when the door slammed against the wall. A heavy figure filled the frame. Dylan. He stood tall, shoulders broad, his dark coat flapping with the wind. His scarred jaw caught the lantern light, the jagged line twisting his sneer into something almost monstrous. His black eyes glittered with malice as they swept the room, landing on Jack with disbelief. His beard, coarse and streaked with gray, framed a face that had known too much anger and too little restraint. The veins in his thick neck bulged as rage surged through him. "Who the hell are you?" Dylan roared, his voice a gravelly growl. His hands clenched into fists, scarred knuckles white. Jack rose to his full height, towering over Sarah's frail form. His voice was calm, lethal. The man who's ending this. Buddy's growl deepened, the fur along his spine bristling, his stance ready to spring. Dylan stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind him. "You shouldn't have come here," he snarled, his eyes flicking toward Emily, narrowing with cruel recognition. "I knew you'd run. Should have let the storm finish you." Emily's body shook, but she stood, positioning herself in front of her sister. Jack stepped forward, his rifle angled across his chest. Dylan lunged with surprising speed, his bulk moving like a charging bull. Jack sidestepped, swinging the butt of the rifle into Dylan's ribs. The impact thudded, but Dylan barely faltered, grunting with rage. He swung a fist, catching Jack's jaw in a glancing blow that sent him staggering back against the table. The lantern teetered dangerously, flames licking high. Buddy leapt, teeth bared, clamping onto Dylan's forearm. The man roared in pain, thrashing, but Buddy held fast, his powerful jaws locked. Dylan swung his arm wildly, slamming Buddy against the wall, but the dog refused to release. Jack recovered, driving his shoulder into Dylan's chest, shoving him back. The two men crashed into the table. The lantern fell, glass shattering, oil splattering across the floor. Fire leapt instantly, flames racing along the warped boards. Emily screamed, dragging Sarah toward the door. Smoke began to curl thickly in the confined space. Dylan shoved Jack away, his dark eyes blazing with fury. "You'll die with them," he spat, reaching for a knife tucked into his belt. The blade gleamed cruelly in the firelight. Jack raised his rifle, his voice steady, cold. "Not today." The flames roared higher, the cabin groaning under the assault. Buddy, blood streaking his muzzle, growled fiercely, positioning himself between Jack and Dylan, ready to attack again. The air grew thick, smoke stinging their eyes, choking their lungs. The confrontation was far from over, but one truth was clear. In this cabin, with fire rising and hatred boiling, only one side would leave standing. The flames clawed at the cabin walls, boards cracking and groaning as fire spread with ravenous speed. Smoke filled the air, searing lungs and stinging eyes. Jack Miller moved with grim precision, his arm hooked under Sarah Carter's fragile frame. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling like a reed in the wind, her golden hair, hacked short and uneven, clinging to her sweat-soaked face. Her green eyes fluttered, dull with exhaustion, yet flickering faintly with recognition when she looked at Emily, who clung to her other side. Emily's chestnut hair stuck to her tear-streaked cheeks, but her hazel eyes burned with fierce resolve as she whispered assurances to her sister. Buddy led the way, darting through the smoke-filled room, his sable and black fur alight with glowing embers that fell harmlessly as he shook them off. His bark rang clear above the roar of fire, sharp and commanding, guiding them to the shattered doorway. Behind them, Dylan bellowed, staggering with blood on his arm where Buddy's teeth had torn him. His broad frame filled with fury as he staggered toward them, his scarred jaw twisted into a mask of rage. Knife still clutched in his hand, he lurched forward, black eyes burning with hatred. Jack turned sharply, rifle raised, his steel-blue eyes locked on Dylan, his voice cold and cutting. "It ends now." Dylan snarled and lunged, but Buddy leapt first, slamming into his chest. The two crashed into the collapsing table, and flames surged higher. Jack didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he struck Dylan across the temple with the butt of his rifle. The man crumpled, the knife skittering across the floor. Buddy released his grip, panting, his amber eyes locked on the downed enemy. The roof groaned, sparks raining down. Jack barked a command. "Out now!" He half-carried Sarah toward the door, Emily clutching her sister's other arm. Buddy bounded ahead, barking furiously as if carving a path through the choking smoke. Together they burst into the open night air, collapsing into the snow. The storm had softened, snowflakes drifting gently, the quiet shock of cold air a blessing after the furnace inside. Jack laid Sarah gently against Emily's chest, then pulled his rifle skyward. He fired once, the crack echoing across the valley. He fired again, then a third time, 3 shots, the universal call for distress. The sound shattered the mountain silence, carrying far into the night. Minutes dragged like hours. Jack's breath smoked in the air, his chest heaving as he scanned the ridges. Buddy stood at his side, panting, ears perked, body trembling with the aftershock of battle, yet ready for more. Then, faint at first, came the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades. A searchlight cut through the dark sky, sweeping across the clearing until it landed on them. Relief surged through Emily's exhausted face, tears spilling as the beam illuminated Sarah's pale features. A Gallatin County sheriff's truck broke. Through the tree line minutes later, headlights cutting the snow. Sheriff Brody emerged, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a lined, weather-worn face and a mustache dusted with gray. His uniform jacket was buttoned high against the cold, his brown eyes sharp with authority, but softened by a natural calm. He moved with the steady confidence of a man who had seen decades of trouble and learned not to waste words. Behind him came 2 deputies and a medic. The medic, a young woman with freckles and auburn hair tied back in a bun, knelt immediately beside Sarah, checking her pulse, wrapping her in thermal blankets, and starting an IV. "Michael?" the sheriff asked, scanning Jack with recognition of a fellow veteran. Jack shook his head once. "Name's Jack Miller," he said, his voice steady. "This woman, Sarah Carter." Dylan was holding her prisoner. Jack gestured toward the burning cabin, flames roaring into the night. The sheriff's eyes darkened with anger, his jaw tightening as he motioned for his men to retrieve Dylan. The deputies rushed inside, dragging the unconscious man out before the cabin collapsed in on itself with a thunderous crash. Dylan's scarred face was slack, his wrists quickly bound in steel cuffs. Sheriff Brody looked down at him with thinly veiled contempt. "You'll answer for this," he said flatly, before turning to Jack. "You did good bringing them out." Jack gave no reply, only adjusted the strap of his rifle, his expression unreadable. Emily clung to Sarah, whispering softly, stroking her sister's ragged hair as warmth slowly returned to her pale cheeks. Sarah's lips parted, her voice weak but audible. "Emily, you came back." Emily's tears spilled freely. "I never left you," she whispered. "Not for a second." Jack stood a few feet away, Buddy pressed against his leg. The dog's head rested on Jack's thigh, amber eyes watching the sisters with quiet understanding. Jack's gaze lingered on them, and for a fleeting moment he allowed himself to feel the fragile warmth of victory. Not triumph, not glory, just the quiet relief of lives saved. Days later, as the Carter sisters recovered in town, Emily approached Jack outside the sheriff's office. Her cheeks had regained color, her hazel eyes still carrying the exhaustion of weeks of terror, but also something steadier, gratitude. Sarah walked slowly beside her, thinner than ever, her golden hair uneven, but her green eyes brighter now. Her steps were weak, yet she moved with determination, leaning only lightly on her sister's arm. Emily spoke softly, her voice hesitant. "We found something when we went through the old papers. The land Dylan wanted. It belonged to your grandfather, David Miller." She searched his face. "This place, these mountains, they're part of your family's legacy." Jack froze, his steel blue eyes flickering with something between shock and recognition, memories. Stirred, fragments of stories half told by his father, the unspoken sadness in his grandfather's eyes, the kilainets that had always hung over certain chapters of his family history. For years, Jack had thought he came here to disappear. Now he understood he had come home. Emily placed a folded deed in his hands. "It's yours. But I don't think you should keep it for yourself. We want to use it for something better, something lasting." Sarah, her voice still frail but firm, added, "We want to build a trust. For veterans, for women who've suffered, for anyone who needs a refuge." Jack looked down at the papers, then at Buddy, whose steady gaze met his as though echoing the same truth. Slowly, Jack nodded. Then that's what we'll do. In the months that followed, the Miller Carter Foundation was born, its mission carved from pain but grounded in hope. The land was placed under protection, leased to ethical companies with strict conditions, profits funneled into shelters, programs, and support. The cabin in the woods had become ashes, but from those ashes rose something enduring. Jack remained in the mountains, but he was no longer alone. Emily and Sarah stayed, their bond with him cemented by fire and survival. Together with Buddy, the loyal guardian whose amber eyes had guided them through despair, they forged a family not by blood but by choice. On a spring morning, as sunlight melted the last of the snow, Jack stood on the ridge above the valley. Buddy sat at his side, tail thumping once against the earth. Emily and Sarah stood nearby, their faces lifted to the light. Jack breathed deeply, the air sharp and clean, and for the first time in years he felt not the weight of the past, but the pull of tomorrow. They had faced fire and fury, cruelty and fear, and in the end they had found something greater, deliverance, and the fragile promise of a new beginning. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a weary soldier, a loyal dog, and a woman's desperate plea. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was the quiet hand of God guiding them through fire and snow to find not only survival, but family, hope, and redemption. And maybe that's the message for all of us, that even in our daily struggles, whether it's loneliness, hardship, or the weight of memories, there is always a light waiting, often in the places we least expect. A kind word, a loyal friend, or a simple act of courage can be the very miracle someone prayed for. As we close this story, may God bless you and your loved ones, and may His grace remind you that hope is never lost. If this tale touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little faith today. Leave us your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to our channel for more soul-stirring stories, and join us in keeping alive the belief that miracles are still among us.